Hello everyone. As we begin our study of poverty, inequality, and development, our topics for Chapter 5, I think it's useful to think about this in the context of where we began in Chapter 1, and actually also what we've been doing in the interim time as well. And so we began with the capabilities to function approach in Chapter 1 as a valuable framework that would help us think about economic development in a multidimensional way throughout the class. And so generally, partly in this capabilities to function framework, we can think about welfare as being a function of a variety of elements for people. Income is naturally one, albeit in an indirect way, in an instrumental way to achieving capabilities to function. Clearly, as we saw already, even in Chapter 1, education and health, E&H in this notation, are foundational to achieving capabilities to function. There are many other important variables as well. I mentioned one more here, M for empowerment, which we saw in Chapter 1, was very important in the way poor people themselves saw their poverty and their opportunities to escape from poverty. So far, all of these have been primarily considered as averages. We've thought about average income in comparing countries in general in Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we also considered a way of measuring the level of development, the Human Development Index, as depending on income, but also health and education, still as averages. We were looking at some indicator of average health. The life expectancy is that, and that's the way it's measured there in the HDI, and also average education, which was considered in the context of average education in the population and average amount of education expected for those who are yet to now begin their schooling. In all of these situations, though, distribution also matters. We talked quite a bit in the first chapter about the differences in living standards around the world, and there, both poverty and distribution, implicitly, were having an important role. In Chapters 3 and 4, we primarily focused on average income. First, as we considered economic growth of income, and also, secondly, when we looked at problems of getting growth started in the first place or continuing growth over time, where we focused on important but often otherwise overlooked market failures, including coordination failures prominently, as well as market failures related to availability of information. And so that gave us a framework first for thinking about economic growth, including relevant market failures, and then a beginning look at development policy when we looked at growth diagnostics. We were thinking about average income at first as being the objective, accelerating growth of that average income through the means of finding what's the binding constraint that we have in our economy, in a specific economy, on achieving higher levels of investment and higher levels or more effective levels of entrepreneurship. And so we had come that far, while in growth diagnostics, we completed our discussion by talking about the fact it can be applied a little bit more broadly, still thinking about growth, but with a special emphasis on inclusive growth, where our application had to do with including women in more accelerated economic growth. So we've begun then in our last couple of chapters thinking about average income as the outcome variable in the development process of interest. But again, distribution is important also. And in this chapter, we're going to expand our idea about development, even measured as income, from averages to consider relative inequality of income and absolute income poverty. These two things, relative inequality and absolute poverty, are very fundamentally different. And so one thing that will be important in our examination of poverty, inequality, and development is to keep carefully in mind the differences between inequality and poverty and the different roles that they play in our assessment of successful or unsuccessful economic development. So then the reduced but important part of our social welfare function as we begin our study of Chapter 5 is that welfare will depend upon average income, but also on inequality of that income and also poverty within the country, people who have a below poverty threshold amount of income. We go from there, however, to think further about multidimensional aspects of development as we examine how to mention and how to analyze multidimensional poverty. Specifically, we're going to add health and education deprivations to our poverty analysis. Much as in Chapter 2, we added average health and average education to our average income to have an overall index of economy-wide average performance. We'll come back to some of these topics as we go forwards in the class. Inequality will be considered again. For example, in Chapter 8, we will explicitly examine inequality of education. To a degree, we'll also talk about inequality of health. In Chapter 9, when we look at agriculture and development, we'll look specifically at inequality in the distribution of land, which is one of the factors that can slow down the possibilities of economic development through enhancing the agriculture sector and the role that it plays. So then what we'll do next is to turn attention to how we measure inequality of income and then how we measure income poverty. And then we'll begin to put these inequality and poverty components of our analysis to work in our development policy analysis.